On September 29th, my boss called me into her office to fire me and save the company $842,000 in pension payments. She didn't know I had a recording device in my pocket, or that the person waiting in the lobby was a federal auditor I had called 3 days earlier. Jessica Sterling's office sat on the 32nd floor of Stratton Oakley Financial, behind a glass wall that turned every meeting into a display. Dallas glittered outside her window. Inside, the room was staged, new leather, a stainless steel nameplate, and a framed quote about efficiency. At 9:12 a.m., she didn't invite me to sit. Brad from Human Resources was already there, perched in the corner chair with his laptop open and his eyes down. "Barbara," Jessica said, using my name like a file label. "This is a formal separation meeting." I sat anyway. I had worn an older suit on purpose. People like Jessica saw worn fabric and assumed worn judgment. My tote bag rested at my feet. The recorder inside was already running, time-stamped and encrypted, saving to a cloud folder labeled company retention. I had helped design that system 15 years earlier, when I worked on the firm's digital archiving policy. Jessica slid a termination packet across the desk. "Given the pattern of performance issues documented in your file," she said, "we're proceeding with termination for cause, effective today." For cause was the whole point. It wasn't just a firing. It was a race against October 1st, 2026, my vesting date. 2 days later, and my pension would lock at $842,500. 2 days earlier, and the money stayed inside their bonus pool. I didn't open the packet. I looked at the footer instead. An internal human resources form, revised earlier that year. Company forms always told the truth before people did. "Before we begin," I said, "confirm you're relying on the corrective action procedure, the 3-warning standard." Brad shifted. Jessica's smile stayed, but her eyes tightened. "We're relying on your documented record," she said. "Then you'll want that record to be complete," I replied. On September 26th, at 6:41 p.m., I had been sitting at my kitchen table, drafting a single sentence until it sounded like something a judge would respect. A formal request under Texas labor law for my complete personnel file, submitted in writing. I printed it, signed it in blue ink, and hand-delivered it to Brad at 8:05 a.m. the next morning. He accepted it like it was radioactive. He told me it would take a few days. In the same breath, he told me my termination meeting was scheduled for the 29th. That was when the calendar stopped looking normal and started looking designed. Strike one had happened on September 14th, 2026, at 3:27 p.m. Jessica had called me into a conference room and handed me a document labeled Final Warning. It accused me of a client allocation error on a long-standing account, a trade I had never entered. The date printed on the page read August 30th, backdated. At 4:18 p.m., I submitted my rebuttal attaching system access logs that proved my credentials never touched the transaction. Brad acknowledged receipt at 4:26 p.m. The email subject line read, "Rebuttal received." 2 days later, my human resources portal showed nothing. The document was gone. The email was gone. "Accident," Brad had whispered in the hallway. "System glitch." I watched him now, sweating in the corner chair, and I knew exactly what kind of glitch it was. Jessica clicked her pen. "If you'll sign on page 3, she said, "we can keep this respectful." I opened the packet. My name was printed neatly above a blank line, waiting for my hand to become their evidence. Down in the lobby, the auditor checked in under the name I had provided. And at 10 a.m., exactly 1 hour before Jessica planned to end me, my report was scheduled to send automatically. The subject line read, "Urgent. Personnel file discrepancy." Vance. Somewhere in the building, a compliance shadow server mirrored every so-called deleted record in read-only silence, waiting for the audit committee to notice. All I had to do was let her believe I was signing my own end. I signed nothing that morning, but I let Jessica believe I would. The second I stepped out of her office at 9:28 a.m., the building felt different, like a stage after the lights dim. Stratton Oakley had always been quiet, but now every sound carried. Keyboards clicked. Elevators chimed. Somewhere, a junior analyst laughed too loudly. Jessica had arrived 6 months earlier, on March 3, 2026, with a PowerPoint titled Regional Alignment Initiative. Slide 7 was labeled Operational Streamlining. Slide 8 was labeled Compensation Optimization. No names, just numbers. I recognized the pattern immediately. Anyone with a vesting date inside a fiscal quarter became a liability. By April, the older advisors were being called into meetings about energy and adaptability. By May, offices with windows quietly changed hands. By June, my desk was moved from the east-facing glass to a cubicle near the restrooms, justified as team cohesion. I said thank you. That unsettled her more than resistance ever would have. Strike 2 came disguised as client care. On September 18th, at 11:02 a.m., Jessica reassigned my oldest client, a $5 million family trust I had managed since 2009, to a junior representative named Tyler. No notice. No transition call. At 3:46 p.m., the client emailed me asking why I had abandoned them. At 4:10 p.m., Jessica logged the complaint as a client dissatisfaction event and attached it to my performance file. Brad sent me the notice with a frowning emoji in the body. He deleted it 5 minutes later. I saved the original. That night, I stayed late. At 10:37 p.m., the office was empty except for Sarah from compliance, still at her desk, reviewing trade surveillance alerts. She nodded when she saw me. She didn't ask questions. She never did. At home at 2:04 a.m., I spread papers across my kitchen table and picked up a yellow highlighter. 2 versions of the same document. Same header, same footer. Different metadata. One showed my digital signature applied just after 3 p.m. on August 30th. The other showed my signature copied and pasted shortly after 9 a.m. on September 14th. Forgery doesn't announce itself. It hides in properties and timestamps. At 2:41 a.m., I brewed tea and opened an old folder labeled Archive Policy Drafts. 15 years earlier, I had been asked to simplify digital retention for the auditors. I had insisted on redundancy, on mirrors, on a shadow server only the audit committee could access. Jessica was new. She didn't know the history. She thought deletion meant erasure. At 7:52 a.m. on September 28th, Brad handed me my personnel file in a manila envelope. Incomplete. My rebuttals were missing. My positive reviews from the last several years were gone. The file was heavy with warnings that hadn't existed 2 weeks earlier. I thanked him and went back to my desk. At 8:06 a.m., I compared his version to my local backups and the compliance mirror. The discrepancies lined up perfectly. Dates altered. Signatures forged. Records removed after my written request. That made it criminal. At 8:59 a.m., I scheduled the email. Recipients: the board's audit committee and the federal whistleblower portal. Delivery time: 10 a.m. At 9:58 a.m., Jessica called and told me to return to her office for final signatures. At 9:59 a.m., my phone vibrated once. Sent. At 10:01 a.m., the building went quiet in a way I had never heard before. Not silent. Suspended. I was seated in conference room 32A, the glass-walled boardroom facing the main trading floor. Jessica had chosen it deliberately. She believed terminations should be visible, a lesson for everyone else. Brad sat beside her, laptop open, hands folded so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. Jessica stood at the head of the table, papers arranged with geometric precision. She smiled again. This won't take long. At 10:03 a.m., she began reading from the script. Dates, file names, violations that existed only because someone had typed them into being. I listened without interruption. Calm was my last courtesy. At 10:07 a.m., she slid the termination letter toward me. Sign here, she said, and Human Resources will escort you to collect your belongings. Through the glass, I could see heads lifting across the trading floor. People pretending not to watch. People watching anyway. I picked up the pen, then placed it down carefully, aligning it with the edge of the page. Before I sign, I said, I need to confirm this file reflects my complete personnel record. Brad swallowed. Jessica didn't look at him. It does, she said. At 10:09 a.m., the boardroom door opened. The chief executive officer stepped in first. then the general counsel, then Sarah from compliance. Behind them, security. Jessica froze mid-smile. "This is a private meeting," she said. "It isn't," the general counsel replied as he connected a laptop to the screen at the end of the table. The subject line appeared first. Urgent, personnel file discrepancy. Vance. The screen filled with side-by-side documents. Highlighted sections. Metadata fields enlarged. Timestamps circled in red. At 10:12 a.m., Sarah spoke, her voice steady. These records were altered after a formal request under Texas labor law. Deletions were attempted. All actions were mirrored to the compliance shadow server. Jessica turned toward Brad. "You said this was handled." Brad cracked. "She told me to delete it." At 10:14 a.m., the general counsel closed the folder. "Jessica Sterling," he said, "you are being terminated for gross misconduct, effective immediately." Security stepped forward. Through the glass walls, the entire office watched as she was escorted out. No shouting, no tears, just the sound of her heels stopping. At 10:17 a.m., the chief executive officer looked at me. "Your pension vests on October 1st, he said. "We're vesting it today." At 10:19 a.m., a settlement agreement slid across the table. Quiet, clean, $250,000 in exchange for silence. I signed. By 10:24 a.m., Jessica Sterling was no longer employed by Stratton Oakley Financial. Her badge lay on the conference table, placed there by security with the same care she used to arrange her folders. Brad was escorted to Human Resources, not for termination, for reassignment, data entry, no access, no authority, a desk without a door. At 10:31 a.m., the chief executive officer apologized, not theatrically, precisely. He used phrases like breakdown in oversight and unacceptable deviation from governance standards. He said my name carefully, like it had weighed again. At 10:38 a.m., my pension confirmation arrived in my inbox. The subject line read, "Vesting confirmation." The amount was $842,500. The effective date was September 29, 2026, 2 days early. Locked, untouchable. The general counsel slid the settlement agreement back toward me, already signed on their side. $250,000, a non-disclosure agreement, mutual non-disparagement, a quiet departure, a clean record. I read every clause, I always did. At 10:46 a.m. I signed. By 11:02 a.m. I was back at my desk, packing my things into the same box I had brought from home. People watched, but no one spoke. Sarah passed by and nodded once. That was enough. At 11:19 a.m. I took the elevator down alone. The auditor in the lobby met my eyes, then looked away. Their work was done. Mine was finished. That afternoon, I drove home through Dallas traffic with the radio off. At 2:07 p.m., I logged into my bank account and watched the numbers settle. Retirement was no longer theoretical. That night, I returned to my kitchen table. The yellow highlighter was still uncapped. Old habits linger longer than jobs. I stacked the papers neatly, then shredded them slowly, page by page. By October 1st, I no longer belonged to the company. 3 months later, I stood on the dock of my lake house, coffee cooling in my hands. The water was still. Predictable, honest. Out of curiosity, I opened LinkedIn. Jessica's profile was still there, open to work. Recommendations disabled. Endorsed for leadership by people who no longer answered her calls. I closed the app. For 20 years, I had kept records so others could feel safe cutting corners. I had stayed quiet because systems worked best when people trusted them. The system worked for me too, just not in the way they expected. Retirement wasn't loud. It wasn't triumphant. It was calm. It was final. And it was earned.